This is Duke University.
Any of the students, you have any questions or right from Cairo that you want to talk about, or you please come.
I have a whole list of questions. So my name's Rami. I'm a senior here at Duke. I'm from Cairo originally, and I spent the past couple of summers there. I just have a couple of comments to make about the initial timeline or the introduction to the event, which I thought was a little bit one-sided. I'm hardly an army sympathizer, but I think kind of going along the lines of what you were saying, we just watched a video where you talked about how Morsi was, there was a huge outpouring of support for his removal, and I thought that didn't come across the reasons why that was the case in the introduction. So one of the things that was mentioned in the introduction was that the army, in the face of protests, relinquished power to Morsi as if it hadn't been the plan initially. I don't think that's entirely correct because it had never been, the victory had never been given to Shafi. There was just a lot of debate before the announcement of the results as to who had won, and then Morsi just was given the presidency. There was no actual struggle at the time of the elections. And then with regards to consolidating executive power, when you mentioned that that was something that Morsi had done, I thought that was a slight understatement, because essentially what had happened was he passed a decree that all of his decrees are immune from judicial review, which is extremely circular, and the logic escapes me and escaped a lot of the Egyptian people. And if you look at the polls, he and the Muslim Brotherhood were extremely popular after they were voted in up until November when that happened, because in the wake of that, so after he passed this decree, there were protests in front of the presidential palace where thousands of the liberals and secular protesters who were there in January 2011, they went out in front of Morsi's palace, and they were obviously protesting this decree, which was completely undemocratic, and Morsi's response to that, and this is something that I feel like hasn't really been carried by the Western media. Morsi's response to that was to essentially call on his supporters, or the Muslim Brotherhood, the members of the Muslim Brotherhood who are all over Cairo and Egypt, to come and essentially remove the protesters. So he never called on state forces, he called on his own supporters to come in and remove the protesters. So that was bringing in citizens for his own political need and for enforcing his own power. And the last thing is the question that you asked during the introduction was, why has the Muslim Brotherhood been outlawed? And a fair case to make that I don't think has been made. I don't think they should have been outlawed, but I think one of the fair cases that could be made is that the Muslim Brotherhood has a history, and their leaders have a history, and have been inciting violence against civilians, such as the example I mentioned in November. And also during the time when the Tamarrud campaign was happening, the petition that people were signing that I think got maybe 15 million, or the numbers vary, but it was at least 15 million signatures. At that time, the leaders, and there are videos of this all over the place, of them essentially saying that these protesters are going to be quashed, that they will be killed, and it's egregious. Some of the things that they say.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the reality. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. These are really good questions to ask, but at the same time, I don't want to lose Matt. We can address it. We'll definitely address it, but I just don't want to lose. Or Matt can address some of them.
Can I? Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Go ahead. He didn't hear my introduction.
Just to address some of those, Rami, thank you for speaking. I think that especially what you mentioned about the West, what hasn't been covered in the Western media, some of the reasons why Morsi why there was such an overwhelming feeling of anger among the Egyptian population against Morsi. The Western media did cover that quite closely, and they did cover that when the constitutional declaration was made in November. You mentioned that Morsi called down his partisans to Ettehadiyya Palace and that area to try to fight off some of the protesters. In fact, that didn't occur. Morsi never did address the public and never did ask for his partisans or for members of the Muslim Brotherhood to go down to at the Hadea Palace. He may have insisted that they do so through channels within the Muslim Brotherhood, but he didn't do so publicly. Assam al-Arian, who was a senior member of the Freedom and Justice Party, which is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, he did ask for members of the Muslim Brotherhood to go down and basically to take care of these protesters who had gathered in front of at the Hadea Palace. We have to remember at the time, and a lot of the reporting that's come out afterwards, is that the security services, the Ministry of Interior, the military, a lot of the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy in Egypt, of course, is massive and controls many of the organs of the state that in the U.S. are taken care of by private companies and by civil society. In Egypt, it's the whole piece of the pie. These people were chosen historically for civil service because of their enmity to Islamists and to the Muslim Brotherhood. So we have a huge bureaucracy that was staffed almost entirely by people who were vetted by state security because they despised the Muslim Brotherhood, because they were anti-Islamist. And the police, when the protesters came out in front of the Hadea Palace, they did not really take much action against these protesters. We saw this. I was there. We saw the protesters walk all the way up to the presidential palace, approach it, and start to throw things over the fence into the area where Mr. Morsi's residence was at the time. So while it sounds very threatening to have, and the press here called them militiates, and they called them the militias of the Muslim Brotherhood that were being called out, it's not necessarily fair, since the Muslim Brotherhood did feel as though their back was against the wall. They felt like they had a president in office who wasn't being protected by the organs of the state that had been appointed and charged with doing so, and they felt that they had to take matters into their own hands. Now, whether that was the right thing to do or not, clearly in retrospect, it wasn't, and they are certainly paying the price. I would mention, though, Morsi is now being charged with murder for those deaths in front of the Hadea Palace. There were about, I think it was 11 people who died that night, the first night that the Muslim Brotherhood people came out and basically dispersed the tent city that was in front of the Hadea Palace. Most of those people were from the Islamist or the Muslim Brotherhood side. The liberal protesters, really very few of them were even hurt. I think probably 2 or 3 of them died. Now, that's not entirely relevant to the question of culpability, but when we're talking about a murder charge against Mohamed Morsi, there's really been quite a lot thrown at him. And so I agree with what you're saying, that we can't understate the degree to which Mohamed Morsi may have screwed up while he was president, may have brought a lot of this on himself. But at the same time, we have to remember that when Morsi arrogated his power over the judiciary, he did so as a reaction to what a lot of people in Egypt saw as a judiciary that was overzealous, that was taking matters way beyond their own remit. Remember that only a couple of months before Mohamed Morsi issued his constitutional declaration, and shortly before he won the presidency, are you still there?
Oh yeah, we're here.
Sorry. And shortly before he won the presidency, the High Court moved to disband the parliament based on rules that, while there was precedence in the 1980s and 1990s for the High Court to disband parliament based on similar statutes, this was a move that the Muslim Brotherhood and some of the Islamists who had won an unprecedented 77% of the parliament for the first time in history, they saw this as an extremely aggressive move by a judiciary that had been public in their hostility toward the Muslim Brotherhood and toward the Islamists. Now, we have a tradition in the United States where judges don't speak publicly, where they don't express their political opinion. Now, here in Egypt, we had Ahmed al-Zind, we had Tahani al-Gabali coming out and saying that they despised the Muslim Brotherhood before they even made any rulings about whether or not they could sit in parliament. So it's unfortunate, but it's not surprising that the Muslim Brotherhood felt as though they had their back up against the wall and they had to take extraordinary actions. Now, one of the problems with the whole Egyptian system right now is that every political actor who gets into any position of authority feels as though they are facing extraordinary circumstances that require an extraordinary response that goes beyond the remit of the law. And that's why we have this terrible cycle of violence where extrajudicial forces like Baltageya, these thugs on the street, or where you have Mohammed Morsi or members of the Muslim Brotherhood telling each other to bring out their partisans into the street. You have these very damaging sort of extra-legal maneuvers because there is no trust in any of the institutions that run the country, except, the grave exception being the military.
And I also wanted to address the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, because that's just not the case. And there is not a hot history of violence behind the Muslim Brotherhood. Most of the violence, the Islamist violence in Egypt, has not been by the Muslim Brotherhood. They've actually, on the contrary, been the victims of a lot of violence from the new military, right? The new military regime. The policy of the Muslim Brotherhood since the 20s has been conversion, preaching, right? Basically political action through nonviolent means. So to say that they actually are a terrorist organization is not the case. There are Islamist terrorist organizations in Egypt. That is true. Most of the violence does not come from the Brotherhood. Okay, I mean, would you agree with that? And would you guys agree with this?
I think I just mentioned what he mentioned about the leaders inciting some sort of violence. Which I wouldn't necessarily declare that terrorism, but it is some form of violence that people deem acceptable. And there's one particular case that I remember very well. I don't know if that. There's one particular case that this one for real I did not hear anywhere in the Western media, but there was one instance where Morsi was at some public. He had some public event. It was at a stadium. I can't remember exactly what stadium, but he was sitting a couple of feet behind one of the religious leaders that I don't think is necessarily within the Muslim Brotherhood, but he was attending that event. And that leader did say something that was very directly inciting violence against the Copts. And then the next day, all over Egypt, there was a number of Copts who were killed. And you can debate the directness of the relationship between the statements.
Sorry, Rami, I'm going to have to correct you there, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Matt.
That was actually that was at Cairo Stadium shortly before the June 30th rollout, and it was not involving Copts, it was involving Shiites. Shiite Muslims in Egypt.
Oh yeah, I remember it being a minority.
So that was when Hassan Shahata and 3 other Shiites in a village outside of Cairo were killed in an anti-Shiite pogrom, and the massive display that Morsi had put on at Cairo Stadium was directed at the war in Syria. And various clerics, mostly Salafi clerics who weren't connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafis who, by the way, supported the coup that ousted Morsi, went up on stage and announced that they were, made very derogatory and inflammatory remarks about Shiites, and essentially encouraged young Egyptian men to go to Syria and make jihad. Morsi himself never engaged in that language, but he did sit by and watch that happen. And then later on, a couple days later, 4 Shiites were killed in this pogrom, but it was not an incitement against Christians.
Okay.
Rami, thank you for your comments. Can we see if anybody else? And we can thank you. I really appreciate. They were very interesting questions and comments. I just want to make sure that other people don't have questions as well, if that's all right. And we can continue this conversation if you want.
Matt, how spontaneous do you think that petition drive that ousted Morsi was? Do you think to any extent was the military behind the petition drive and then the mass protests that occurred?
I can't know. For the last 3 years, I've been in Egypt for the last 5 years. None of the young men who were leading the Tamarod campaign, the rebel campaign, I had never seen any of them run into any of them in any of the activist circles that I had run into, and from the beginning, they took an extraordinarily pro-military tone for activists who had, while they detested the Muslim Brotherhood, many of them were very opposed to going back to the military. And many of them had supported Morsi against Ahmed Shafiq in the 2012 presidential campaign. So it was kind of hard to see where these extremely pro-military youth in the Tomorrowed campaign were coming from, when so many of the revolutionary youth that I had met previously over the previous 2.5 years had been very strong in their objection to military rule. And still today, we're seeing these Tomorrowed campaigners meeting with the military and expressing their support to the police. Just this week, we had the Tomorrowed campaigners saying that they were very much behind the police on Police Day, which is on Saturday, January 25th, the 3rd anniversary of the revolution. So these people, it's not quite clear whether they had help from the military or from some sort of former NDP apparatus, but right now they certainly don't seem to have carry much weight with the mainstream activist youth who overthrew Mubarak in 2011, as much as they try to pose and posture as part of that group.
Any other questions?
So let's take like 2 more questions from students. If you have any specifically on to ask Matt directly, please just come to the front and. Oh, yeah, we have one.
So you spoke earlier about the parliamentary elections in which the Muslim Brotherhood took around, I believe it was 77% of the votes. And we had spoken in class about how much of that was attributed to the fact that the other groups that had opposed the regime had simply sort of failed to organize, and that the Muslim Brotherhood already had a significant infrastructure and organization, and that led them to sort of sweep the votes. And I was wondering, given that it's several years later, have we seen any other groups mobilize that would be able to sort of take a majority, or have the secular liberal protesters still sort of failed to have like a coalition that would be feasible in any parliamentary or general elections?
We have. And first of all, I just want to mention the 77% was not the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, I think, won something on the order of 48%. But it was 77% with all of the Islamist groups put together, including the Salafis and the Wasat Party and some other more moderate groups, and some groups that are more connected even to jihadi groups like el-Jamaa al-Islamiyya. But when we're looking at the level of organization among some of the liberals, really, there's sort of 2 sets of political scaffolding that runs throughout the country, throughout the provinces, and that is the Islamists and the old regime, the NDP, and those who have taken sort of a pro-military nationalist stance. And now, when June 30th came around, I was speaking to some of the more revolutionary political parties, like Mohammed Abu Ghar from the Egyptian Social Democratic Party. And he said, basically, look, we have abandoned our resistance to allying with members of the former regime. That's no longer practical. If you remember from your class, you probably noted how after the revolution ousted Hosni Mubarak, people who were involved in the revolution, in the Muslim Brotherhood, and throughout the political spectrum, were trying to isolate and sort of remove from power anyone who had any real connections to the former regime. Now, that is totally reversed, and it is the former regime politicians from the provinces and from here in Cairo that are really storming to the forefront, because they're the ones who have the roots that go throughout the country. They're the ones who have the organized political networks. And some of these organized political networks, like with the Islamists, they run in sort of charitable networks and things like that. The NDP, they run with systems of patronage and political sort of horse trading and favors. And so I'm not going to call it corruption outright, because it simply doesn't always take the form of corruption. And they engage in much of the same sort of political, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, that the Islamists do. But they have networks and systems that are in place. and they know who they trust. They know where the bodies are hidden, figuratively speaking. And so they're able to work on that, and they're able to actually bring themselves into office. And most of the sort of secular liberals, unless they're from certain neighborhoods in Cairo where they're well known and where they're going to get a lot of support, they're not going to be able to get themselves elected into office. And that's why after the parliamentary elections, you saw the presidential elections coming down to just the dichotomy that has always defined Egypt, which was Ahmed Shafiq representing the old regime and the military and the sort of pro-nationalist forces, and Mohamed Morsi representing the Islamists. And that's the dichotomy that a lot of the people who were in Tahrir Square throughout the 18 days in 2011 had hoped would have been rejected, and that something new and different would have come up. But that's still the paradigm with which we have to view Egyptian politics, is the fight between these two forces.
Thank you. Any other questions? Do any of the other students have any questions that they want to pose to Matt? Can I ask a quick question? Is that all right? I did have a question about you saying there's no opposition to the new constitution. My impression about the new constitution, though, as opposed to the 2012 one, was that there's a lot of transparency here, despite the criticism. There's a lot of transparency around the promulgation of the 2012. You could easily find it online in Arabic and in English. There was a lot of debate. There were a lot of committees formed. There were a lot of people consulted. My impression with this constitution, first of all, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but I have searched hard, and I have not been able to find actually a readily available draft, either in Arabic or in English, Googling both. There was little debate. The media is now very controlled by the military. A lot of the information in the press has been very vote yes, right, for the new constitution. So I wonder if the massive support behind it is partially an illusion of what the press is actually, an image the press is actually putting forth, and they're not showing or representing, not you, but the Egyptian press is not showing or putting forth, right, partially because the military is now controlling the press. And then some people have been saying that the 98% support behind the vote is actually evidence that the vote was not necessarily a fair one.
Well, I mean, I think we're almost flattering the Egyptian public when we say that the military is controlling the media. Mm-hmm. I don't think they are. Mm-hmm. I think the media is acting very much on its own and very much under its own volition, and is just readers for the military because they want to be. The military, or the media sort of, the private media and the public media felt very threatened by Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were very happy to see his back. And so what we saw in the media running up to the vote for the referendum was we saw very little actual substantive discussion about the Constitution. We saw people talking about the guarantees that would be there for women, for the handicapped, some economic issues reduced.
Right. The most recent one. We're talking about the most recent one, right?
Much of it's not particularly strong language, and it didn't really set the new constitution apart that much from the one that was voted in 2012 under Morsi. Right. It's a very, very similar constitution, and very similar to the 1972 constitution that was promulgated under Sadat. So we're not reinventing the wheel here. But one of the things we saw in the media was a very dishonest representation of how voting yes in the Constitution would simply mean moving the wheels. There's a constant phrase used here in the Egyptian media, the wheel of production. And the wheel of production would continue if you vote yes. And also it would be a vote against terrorism. There was, outside my window here, you could see votes for yes all over the place. And all of these billboards that put up yes campaign posters were a lot of them
put up those billboards? That's part of the question.
Sorry?
Who put up those billboards?
A man named Tariq Noor, who helped run Mubarak's campaign in 2005 for president. He helped run the campaign for the flat tax, I think, in 2002. He was very, very much behind Shafiq in his presidential campaign. And he's just a mouthpiece for the old regime. And he put up quite a bit of private money. And I went to his offices and met with he and his son, and they're very slick and very, very smooth talking guys. Great heads of hair on both of them. And they said, basically they showed us one ad that they were about to release throughout on private television stations throughout the country. And what it showed was, for one of the examples of the ad was a picture of a young Christian girl who had been shot dead in front of a church on Warwick Island a couple of months ago in a shooting for which the perpetrator has not yet been found, and no suspects have been arrested. But the government decided in one of their peremptory decisions that this was the fault of the Muslim Brotherhood, who had assassinated this schoolgirl when she was leaving church. So they showed an image of this schoolgirl, and then and with some stirring emotional music in the background, and then they moved to an image, a written text that said terrorism has no religion, and then they moved to vote yes for the Constitution. Another image, and pictures of Egyptians in the street on June 30th, which was making a very, very bold, very problematic connection between fighting terrorism, an act of terrorism, by the way, that had never been connected with the Muslim Brotherhood, the shooting of this girl on Warwick Island, and voting yes for the Constitution. So this sort of type of advertising could be found throughout the Egyptian media in the months leading up to the Constitution. In fact, these guys, the Noors, had put up this ad campaign about voting yes before the Constitution had been finished. So they didn't really know what the document would look like, but they knew that voting yes for the Constitution meant more than just voting for the substance and the text of the document itself, and more just for blessing this military-backed regime and allowing them to continue on and giving them a mandate to continue the same sort of behavior that they've been engaging in for the last 6 months. And that is how that referendum has functioned in the public imagination.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Just a number of students might have to leave because this is really the end of the course period. But those of you, if you want to stay and ask more questions, you're welcome. But I know that you may have other classes to go to.
I just wanted to say before I ask my question that I'm really thankful for your social media presence. It's been really helpful for me and my friends who were in Egypt over the summer and are now back in the States and want to keep in touch with what's going on. But I had a quick question before I ran off to class, kind of a follow-up to your conversation about the Constitution that was just passed. I know you had said that there was a 98% kind of like yes vote. And a counter narrative that I had been hearing, and wasn't really sure if it was true, is that there was a lot of abstentions because a lot of people were worried about the actual vote of no in such a kind of uncertain time with kind of a return to military rule. I was wondering if that was more of a true statement, or if that was more of a Western media type idea, or how that really played out in Egypt during this election, or during this constitutional thing.
Well, we don't have firm demographic details, but what the anecdotal evidence points to the idea that a lot of young people stayed home and decided not to vote. And the participation rate was only about 38%, which wasn't nearly the level that the government wanted. They wanted to see something in the 60s. The participation rate was really only a hair higher than it was when the Muslim Brotherhood had their constitution. So now what we're seeing is a constitution that was passed by a huge margin, but with a minority of the public voting. And a lot of the people who abstained, apparently, according to anecdotal evidence, and I've heard this from people at the U.S. Embassy, we've heard this anxiety coming from government officials, from young activists, from liberal politicians. There's a feeling that young people were not engaged in this referendum. And that was because they were, Amr Moussa, the former presidential candidate and the former head of the Arab League, he opined that maybe this was because they were turned off by this sort of very propagandistic outpouring of encouragement for the yes vote. That maybe the young people just saw this as one of the trappings of a military state, or a military state in the making. And that might be true. That might have turned off quite a bit of young voters. Or a lot of people just might have felt as though this being, I think it was probably the 5th or 6th election cycle that has happened in Egypt since February 2011, that this was not going anywhere, and that the military seemed to be back in power and the former regimes seemed to be back in power, and they were frustrated from voting. But I wouldn't say there were a lot of abstentions, because I think an abstention would require you to go to the polling place and fill out an abstention ballot. But there were a lot of people who simply stayed home.
Yeah, I guess as a follow-up to that, from my very limited pool of Egyptian friends that I did speak to before this constitutional vote, they expressed concern that even if they were to go to the polls and vote no, that there would be some sort of like backlash from the government itself. I didn't know if that was a common view or if that was just a general, my friends were worried kind of thing. Yeah, like a fear of voting no, as opposed to just not going to the polls.
That they might be detained or harassed at the polling station?
Yeah, or like a list is what they described as.
Sorry,
they described it as like they'd be put on some list of people that voted no, and it would have some sort of negative backlash in the future.
You never know.
Yeah.
I doubt that would have happened. There were a fair number of people who voted no. I mean, by fair number, I mean less than 4%. But I mean, there were people who voted no, and I don't think they're on any list. I think the government, at the end of the day, is conscious of the fact that a 97% or 98% yes vote looks like elections under Saddam Hussein, and doesn't want to have that look. They'd rather have a referendum that passed with what looked like a healthy debate, rather than a referendum that passed in what looks like the kind of election that a totalitarian society holds up to the rest of the world as proof of its popularity. That this government is not immune to criticism from the West, and they understand it because they respond to it on a regular basis. So I'm sure they would have loved to have seen more no voters, as a matter of fact. Something that would have made it look like there was actually a vibrant debate going on, instead of just an overwhelming yes campaign and really one of intimidation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, man. That was really interesting, and we'll hope to do it again some other time in the near future. And best of luck.
Thanks very much.
Yes, it was great to meet you virtually, so maybe we'll meet sometime here or there.